My name's Dean McCormick from Black Arrow, and we have the other panelists here this afternoon, which you can see on the screen here, who have actually graciously opted to not be lavishly introduced to afford us time to really get into discussion here this afternoon. So TV everywhere is taking a good deal of abuse from inside the industry for several years. It's one of these type of platforms or developments that's sort of always on the horizon, ready to break out, and not quite there. So without launching into a whole discussion here of how now we're about to break out, given what's been happening over the last several months in the past year, I'll let our panelists speak to that. But I do think there are a lot of developments and changes recently made this a very topical, opportune time to be having this discussion here this afternoon. So I'll mention just a few. I think recently was ABC announced that they're going to be doing live streaming to their affiliate stations around the country on an authenticated basis. So I think that's probably the first broadcast network to do that, and there's been a lot of success with TV everywhere in general. I think with live sporting events like the Olympics, the NCAA. So that's been definitely a TV everywhere success story. We'll get into some of the not so successful stories, I guess. And then there was an article just in the Times yesterday, the New York Times yesterday, which was on video on demand and sort of the exponential growth there, video on demand viewing of primetime TV, which I think we would consider a TV everywhere platform, although it's different than a lot of the other platforms, especially on the authentication basis. But I think it's sort of conceptually TV everywhere. And that article actually mentioned TV everywhere and some of the continuing challenges from the perspective of the author. So, and then a lot of, the upfronts are going on right now. Last week was the major broadcast upfronts. The negotiations are going on now, and multi-platform, over-the-top, various platforms targeting audiences with through primetime programming are very much part of the upfront discussions. So we'll get into some of that, of how this content is being looked at by agencies and monetized and so forth. So anyway, we're just going to try to separate, I think, a lot of the reality from the hype, and without getting too much into the weeds on what is really a complicated issue, as Duncan was reminding us a little earlier. But we've got the right team to do it here. So, so without further ado here, I'm going to ask Ashley. Ashley, can everybody hear me okay, first of all? Okay. And if you can't hear any of the panelists as they start talking, please speak up right away. Or just move to the front. Ashley Still is a Director of Product Management at Adobe Video Solutions. And I was going to ask you, Ashley, if you could sort of kick us off by talking conceptually about TV everywhere. What's the intention behind it? Who are the players behind it? Why does it exist? Just even before we get into sort of the definition of what it is.
Sure, yeah. Absolutely. A good tenet to always hold is that consumers ultimately get what they want, or they usually get what they want. And what consumers want in video is access to their content across devices at the time that they want to watch it, right? And so that consumer demand is driving increase in VOD on television. It's also driving the desire to have access to television content on any device. So how we view TV everywhere at Adobe is the ability for consumers to access live television as well as on-demand television, regardless of where they are, right, on any device that's able to access the internet and play back content, but also from either a pay TV distributor or directly from the brand. And that is very, very different from the way that television works today, where obviously for cable networks, the only way to get access to a cable network channel as a consumer is through a pay TV provider. You can't go directly to ESPN's website or directly to an ESPN channel without first having a Comcast subscription or a DirecTV subscription. So that's very different, that the consumer can now either go to watch ESPN or they can go to Xfinity to watch the same content. So where we see a lot of people sometimes where they say TV everywhere, they mean just the pay TV provider sites and applications. We think the definition is much broader, that it includes going direct to a content brand as well. And we run Adobe Pass, which is a service that enables authentication of your paid television content on those programmer sites and apps. So we run the authentication for people like ESPN and Turner and pretty much most other people in the industry. So we've seen tremendous growth. You're talking about, is this real or not? We actually worked very closely with NBC around the London Olympics, and it was a very incredibly successful TV Everywhere event. There were 88 million authenticated streams watched over the course of the 2.5 weeks of the games. Across close to, I think it was 9 million devices that were authenticated. And very interestingly, oftentimes consumers were authenticating multiple devices. So, not only do they want TV everywhere on their iPad, they also want it on their phone, they also want it on their Xbox, they want it in lots of places. And NBC did a lot of work, not just with Adobe, but with other partners, to be able to get a good sense through data of whether or not the TV Everywhere experience was cannibalizing the broadcast experience. And actually, the TV Everywhere experience was at time of air. So if you wanted to watch volleyball at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and you didn't want to wait for the tape delay on broadcast, you could do that on mobile and on the desktop. But in fact, what they saw is that the more people engaged with content in a TV Everywhere environment, it actually increased the likelihood that they engaged with the broadcast that night. Right? So TV Everywhere is not only a way to engage an increasingly fragmented consumer audience, increasingly mobile consumer audience, but it is also a way to get them to engage with your brand and actually drive them to broadcast experiences where obviously the business model is much more known than in TV Everywhere. So some other quick stats: 12-fold growth in TV Everywhere viewing just over the last 12 months. So it is growing. There's growing consumer awareness. One of the challenges certainly is getting consumers to actually put their password into a website or an app. And you've seen improvements like Comcast just rolled out social login for so you can use your Facebook password instead of your Comcast password. And we see a lot of opportunity around in-home authentication. If you are a broadband customer of your pay TV operator, which most people are, that if you're at home, you don't even have to log in. It automatically checks in the background that you have access to the channel that you're trying to watch, and it's completely seamless. So we see a ton of opportunity for TV Everywhere, and we see the growth rates behind it to show that consumers are gaining awareness and definitely desire having access to this content wherever they are.
Great, great. Well, I definitely want to circle back. I think we all do on the growth and the scale, that's great. But just to round out a couple of points on sort of definition, so everyone's clear in the room. So when we're talking about TV Everywhere, it's broadcast content as well as cable network programming, right? All the primetime content across the board, right?
Yep.
And it's, do I have to be on my home network authenticated to watch it, or it's authenticated anywhere?
It's authenticated everywhere. You still have to have a pay TV account.
Right.
Right. And that's the biggest.
That's the big challenge.
That's
some people apparently cannot find their password, right?
Exactly. So how it works is you still have to be a pay TV subscriber. And obviously what this does is it preserves all of the subscription and affiliate revenue that really powers the creation of all this great content. But with that pay TV password, you can log into distributor and content direct programmer broadcasting cable network experiences regardless of where you are.
Right. So whether it's ABC Go or whatever it's called on your iPad app, or their full episode player online, or you're getting it through Cablevision or
Correct.
Fios.
It could be Time Warner Cable, it could be Comcast.
They have their own apps, right?
Exactly.
And you authenticate that.
It could be A&E, right? A&E has TV. It is, exactly.
Are there differences in terms of the experience for the consumer, you know, the ad load or live and on-demand viewing? Are there differences between the operators' portals?
That's a
apps?
great question.
Yeah.
It does completely depend right now. And that's one of the things that I think will get standardized over the next couple of years.
So what's sort of generally the case? What's the general lay of the land there? I'm not talking about, you know, full seasons available here or there. I'm talking about like you can watch live, you can watch on demand, you can
It really depends on what has been rolled out by that individual brand or that individual pay TV provider at that time. So some people, like NBC, for example, they rolled out on demand first, and then they rolled out live. Other people choose to roll out live first. It really depends on the goals, right? I mean, think about it. What's happening is people are trying to get hundreds of channels, live channels, as well as all of that on-demand content available across a completely fragmented device landscape as quickly as possible, right? So it is very confusing for consumers, which is, depending on which apps you go to, you get access to different types of content. Well, you know, sometimes it's live, sometimes it's on demand. I think over the next couple of years, it will naturally normalize itself.
Okay. Well, that actually leads us in. I was going to ask Duncan. Duncan, if you could speak a little bit to what Ashley was just talking about with the sort of the scope of the challenge of getting all this content out to different devices, and what are the sort of technical issues, challenges that have been resolved recently the last several months, and what are maybe one or two, and not 50, Duncan, one or two.
Yeah, I'm sure there's got been a bunch of panels and a bunch of discussions about this. I mean, especially when you start talking about the business of TV everywhere, then we have to focus on a couple of different areas, and there's sort of cost and potential revenue issues. And I'm not just talking about the subscriptions and how you expand the pay TV subscriptions, but things like you know, ad insertion. So if we just deal with that particular opportunity at this point, you know, ad insertion, especially for the operators, is a very complex and very difficult thing to achieve across this huge set of devices. So we've seen a lot of operators start to run or just about to launch market trials for you know, a small set of devices for, you know, specific ad insertion opportunities. Obviously, the media organizations inside these the operators are breathing down the operations guys' necks and the architects' necks to try and understand, you know, what they can do, when they can do it, how they can do it, you know, what the opportunity is. But, you know, the range of complexity, I think, is absolutely immense, and that's one of the reasons that's really held up that side of the business.
The complexity of just being able to splice into a stream and put an ad in there. Yeah,
at the top level, it looks easy, right? Because if you look at it at the very top level, when you're talking about multi-screen, when you're talking about ABR delivery, you're talking about fragments of video and a manifest, and the manifest looks like a playlist. So logically speaking, you should basically, if you look at these two things, you've got an XML file here and a bunch of fragments. You should just be able to say, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert an ad by writing an additional line into the manifest, and that will play, right? Entirely depends on the device. Entirely depends on the device, and it depends on the protocol. So for instance, if you have an iPad or an iPhone running HLS, and you manipulate the manifest in the core, you don't touch the video fragments at all, it will play, because it supports a thing called discontinuity, and you know, there are ways of that, you know, HLS is a relatively simple, structured protocol. It's not particularly clever. It's not particularly elegant, quite frankly, from a technical viewpoint, but it does sort of work. The problem that you have is then people assume that, oh, well, here's an HLS player on Android. That's going to work, right? Wrong. It's not going to work. The HLS apps don't support discontinuity. You're toast. It's done. So, and then you've got things like Smooth and some of the other protocols that have been developed. And by the way, MPEG-Dash, the AVC264, could potentially have this issue as well, where Smooth, for instance, is a much more elegantly designed protocol. But what it does is it doesn't have the ability to reinitiate the decoder. So the challenge that you end up with is it expects all of the fragments, all of the timing and all of the fragments to be lined up. So the challenge that you get is it's not going to work if you just shotgun an ad in there. Mm-hmm. Now, originally when a lot of these players were designed, the assumption was that the device itself would do the ad insertion. Okay, well that's, with the greatest respect, is really stupid. Because if you think about it, let's take the Super Bowl analogy.
Sounds plausible to me, but apparently not.
Right. It sounds entirely plausible, and this is the problem. There are too many assumptions.
It depends on the architecture. So we actually did client-side ad insertion for the Olympics.
I was waiting for that.
We do both, and
no. So the problem that you get
server-side processing can get expensive in the Super Bowl.
So can client-side, because if you think about it, the challenge that you're going to end up with is, much as if the world was all Adobe, we'd be in great shape, actually. We'd have a much more coherent architecture.
Well,
Unfortunately,
you like that
that's not the
soundbite,
case.
don't you?
Sorry?
Ashley likes that soundbite, right?
So
absolutely, and that
the
is
challenge. Sorry, the challenge that you end up with is that from a cost perspective, you've got to be able to deal with multiple different protocols. So the challenge that you have is you're dealing with fundamentally different architectures. If what you try and do is you try and actually produce all of these different protocols, run them across a CDN, you're incurring a massive cost just in the ability to run them across an operator's CDN. So the challenge that you're ending up with is people are starting to make decisions about what they're actually going to repackage where in the network. And the challenge that they're ending up with right now, and one of the reasons that you'll see smart organizations, Comcast is one of them, I would venture to say.
Just adopted primetime across all their devices.
Yeah,
they're doing client-side.
Sales page.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying, like,
I was going to mention primetime. You didn't have to do it yourself, but okay.
They're actually doing client-side ad insertion.
They're doing client-side ad insertion, but the challenge that they've got is that the business case is absolutely there for them not necessarily to do client-side ad insertion across all the protocols.
Oh, definitely.
So the challenge that they're running is that they're running HDS, they're running HLS, and they're running this other funny protocol called Smooth. Mm-hmm. So if what you do is you actually do the math associated with just running those across the storage, bear in mind that they've run open source. They're not using commercially available manufacturer operated CDN equipment. So what they're doing is they've built this capability just doing the math on the storage. You can justify that they use one protocol, mm-hmm. which would be a sensible thing for them to do, as their mezzanine protocol, and then do repackaging at the edge. So the challenge that you then end up with is that for certain protocols, you can actually do a client side. For other protocols, it's not going to work very well. So what you've got to be able to do is then repackage and do the ad insertion at the edge of the network. Mm-hmm. And the challenge that you end up with is a lot of the CDN infrastructure that's been built from an operator standpoint at this point. One of the reasons that we're actually going to start to see rapid commoditization of that is it does not solve some of these problems. There's another layer of intelligence that's actually required to sort all this out. At that point, once we actually get this intelligent layer sitting in there, and there's multiple different ways to do that. We have an approach to it. Adobe has an approach to it. Quite frankly, I think they're somewhat complementary. what will end up happening is that what we'll start to see is a real business case, or what we can start to develop is the real business case for being able to do ad insertion. Now, the other challenge that you were...
Which do you then drives solving these issues, do you think,
Yeah.
or are these...
Well,
Yes.
there's a lot of pressure to solve these issues right now, believe me.
Are these, can I ask, are these issues now holding up? Are there like affiliate agreements that have been done with programmers to distribute to these platforms, and these issues are holding up, you know, consumers actually viewing content on these platforms?
I think, I mean, I'll let the other guys answer obviously some of that question. All I can tell you is that from the point of view that we've seen, what this is really holding up is the opportunity that the operators and you know, and their customers on the media side are pushing towards, which is, I want to be able to do targeted ad insertion. I want to be able to address individuals rather than, you know, zones and all that kind of stuff. The challenge that we've got right now is that it's even complex to figure out how to, you know, comply with blackout. So what you're dealing with is you're actually dealing with a situation where...
Can you explain for everybody what blackout is?
Yeah, blackout is basically the requirement to not play a specific piece of content in a specific location. It's usually associated with sports. I don't want to play that football game in that city for the simple reason I want people going to the game.
Well, and I don't have the rights to it. Yeah.
And I don't have the rights to it. Thank you. That's exactly right.
Right.
So I'm thinking about it from a technical standpoint, obviously. But the challenge you end up with is that what this is leading to is a fairly fundamental rethink of the supporting infrastructure to be able to do all of these things. And that in itself is going to generate a very different sort of ROI and math.
Which is provider infrastructure, or?
No, as I said earlier, it's a very good clarification. What I'm really talking about is the operator infrastructure rather than the sort of the back-end CDN infrastructure. You know, a lot of this complexity really comes to a head in the people who are responsible for delivering the individual streams through into the actual subscribers, and also making sure that they do it with differentiated quality and all of the other things. Mm-hmm. So, on the other hand, I do have to say there's an enormous amount of focus on solving these problems, as there should be. And I do think that what you'll start to see is some very aggressive operator trials coming out in the second half of the year that start to really get to the bottom of trying to address some of these issues.
Okay, great. So, Richard, if you could actually take the ball there, and you may have some perspective on these issues, because I know that you deal from a business standpoint, sales support standpoint at A&E with distributing to these various platforms. But so if you have perspective to add on, you know, how that's going from a technical standpoint, that'd be great. But I also thought you could speak to a little bit about, you know, give us sort of the lay of the land for A&E. What platforms are you distributing to now? Where are the affiliate agreements in place to allow for TV everywhere? And, you know, what does that ad experience look like for your content experience, and ad experience look like for your consumers at this point?
Sure. Well, in the interest of full disclosure, I understood very little of what Duncan was just explaining. Perhaps you guys did, and that's great. But you know what? It's good because it sets up what I think is a relevant juxtaposition for content owners. About 10, 15 years ago, all we had to do was put up an East Coast feed and a West Coast feed, and our job was done. Nobody had to worry about file formats or HLS or streaming or stitching or any of that. And I think that is when you start to home in on the subject of monetizing TV everywhere and why it's difficult. It's not only the technical challenges, but I think there's enormous market challenges. You know, different content owners are doing different things, different distributors are doing different things, and there are very few standards in the market under which buyers and sellers of advertising can act upon. So, you know, I think there are a lot of challenges. I come from the distribution department at A&E, so I have a very MVPD sort of focus on the landscape. One of the issues that I think about a lot is how does the relationship between the MVPD and the content owner, how does that dynamic also affect what we can do in the advertising space? One of the traditional primary roles of a network, a linear network, is to, while people are watching your network, you can do a whole lot of interesting things in a linear basis. Introduce them to new shows, point them to different time slots in your schedule, and constantly bring people back to the network. Well, when you talk about viewing on a time-shifted basis or a place-shifted basis, a lot of that viewing takes place in an on-demand fashion, right? So the way that the content is actually served up through your distribution partners' portals also plays a very important role in how people, sort of interact with that content and what kind of things they find. On the prep call that we had for this panel, one of the other things we got into a little bit was, what is the role, I should say, that data about the viewer play in the advertising landscape as well. When you think about have you all heard of the purchase funnel in the advertising world? So you start out at a very high level with awareness, and as you kind of move through that funnel, you get to awareness. Here's a group of companies or products that are in the consumer's mindset until you all get all the way down to the purchase decision. Broadcasters in general, I think, are very comfortable playing at that awareness level, right? So when you look at all the new technology and you start to go down the funnel, one of the things we're trying to figure out is where will the equilibrium lie, the balance between trying to approach advertising with all of the new technology and what's really cost effective. Because when you think about all the different delivery issues, when you think about the negative inertia in the ad buying market and the fact that agencies and buyers of advertisements, they too are having trouble figuring out what all the different offerings are, you get stuck. And even though you may have the best technology out there and the ability to point to, yes, I know which family owns a dog and which family wants to buy a minivan, sometimes getting that far down the funnel requires an awful lot of money. And I don't think a lot of broadcasters, remember, we come from the business of mass media. I don't think a lot of broadcasters are really equipped to be doing that very well right now. So there's a lot of opportunity, of course, but there's a big need for further evolution and development on the horizon. I probably didn't answer all of the questions you had.
We'll get back to you.
Is that a good start?
Yeah, right. That's a very good start. And yes. And I would just add to that, I think one of the reasons broadcasters don't sell on that basis is, well, one thing is they don't really need to. I mean, the traditional TV business, GRP-based sales is a pretty darn good business. You don't have to provide data.
And is there enough inventory?
Yeah.
I mean, if you got down to
70% of their primetime inventory sells in the futures market without data. So they don't really need to get it.
That's a great point.
The other thing is that it's not there, if you're talking about, and we can get into this later, getting one-to-one to the household to bring real efficiency to buys and really reduce waste, they don't have the data to do that targeting to get to the household, right? They can only index their audiences and things like that. But so I wanted to, so Pat, you work closely with agencies and advertisers, and so could you give us some perspective on how they're seeing this space, or is this, is
It's a headache.
Is multi-screen TV just blowing the minds of traditional television buyers and planners? Are they equipped to handle it? Do they see it as TV?
Well, I think there's some fundamental changes going on in the ad world and the perspectives that people are bringing to it. Richard just talked about the funnel, and I think that there have been a number of studies that one I remember very distinctly, one of my clients did last year, really taking a look using some sophisticated research techniques on, is that funnel still viable? And what they started seeing was that no, it's not. That interactive, both your phone, your PC, but really mobile devices are starting to break the metaphor of the funnel. And so consumers are pinging from getting mass information, maybe on TV, maybe on the web, but then they're pinging down and they'll go to the store, they'll shop with a barcode, they'll go back, they'll get something on the web, they're pinging back and forth. So this notion of the funnel and that it's narrowing is really getting broken. I think the other thing is that traditionally, and it's sort of funny because I remember, years ago, when I got into this, that even 10 years ago, digital and TV were bought and sold by different people, both within the agencies and within the networks. That has not gone away. And so, you're talking about the upfronts. Well, there was, a whole notion of the upfronts, and we were going to combine packages with digital plus TV. Some of that has gone on, but the mindset is still, when I'm buying TV, I'm buying households. When I'm buying digital, I'm typically buying individuals. Now, you would think that there's some magical formula to translate the two, but in terms of the way the mindset of how people buy and how they think, those are still very distinct ways to think about buying advertising. TV is really a push medium where you're pushing a message out, whereas digital has become more and more about a pull medium and interactivity and something that the individual is initiating. So VOD, particularly TV VOD, sort of gets in the middle of that. So you've got the look of TV, but you've got somewhat of the metrics of the web. I think you were asking, are agencies prepared for it? I think, I was not joking when I said a headache. You were talking, 70% of inventory can be bought on prime time, bought ahead of time. Well, yeah, but then you spend 20 to 30% of that same time, or 20 to 30% of those avails can be in dispute. So you buy based upon this whole notion of, oh, it's a $25 CPM, and then you go to reconcile after the show actually runs and it's not, and then you're doing make goods, and there's very little
cancellations.
Yes, and there's very little mechanization in that business infrastructure. So we walked through a bunch of the technical issues of the distribution of streaming. There's an equal side that's also holding things back, which is how do you connect those, the reconciling, not just for metrics, but just for the basic brass bottom dollars. How do you connect the metric side of the business with the distribution side and have that seamless? And it's not until those kinds of mechanics get put in place that some of these problems are solved. And it's interesting.
So, that's good. So can we get into that a little bit? Anyone who can contribute here? These impressions, are they being sold? So television, cable and broadcast television is sold on, for those of you in the audience that may not know, sold on a C3 basis, the bulk of primetime inventory, which is the commercial live airing, same day airing, plus 3 days of DVR playback and now VOD. When the full, in cases where the full C3 ad load, so the 30, the 15 minutes, 16 minutes, whatever it is, broadcast and cable, is dropped into that stream in just the same way that it was. There's some nuances around that, but that's basically it. Then the programmer gets C3 commercial rating credit for those impressions. So are these other platforms outside of DVR playback and live and same day, other platforms and time-shifted inventory, is this being sold on a C3 basis, or? Well,
there's a lot of discussion in the industry about whether or not it's C3, it's C7. About 50% of advertising is date specific. So you think about, huge category in advertising is around, you take autos and movies, you're looking at nearly 20% of the TV ad sales. And both of those are typically time dated. So, the special, and if it's a Memorial Day special, C3 does me a little bit of good, but C7 is nonsensical. So that's where you've got a real, I think that's why people are excited about the notion of dynamic ad insertion that will allow for monetization of the C4 plus.
Right.
That's starting to happen.
Right.
But
Black Arrow is actually providing the analytics to Comcast Spotlight, working with Comcast Spotlight, Comcast Media 360, which is the ad sales arm of Comcast's Comcast to provide those metrics.
But how are you seeing the inventory actually be sold today, and to who? I mean, from our perspective, we've seen kind of a little bit of everything, where sometimes the digital inventory is just given as part of the TV buy as a deal sweetener. Sometimes it's actually, they're trying to sell more, kind of increase the GRP, if you will, and just increase the reach,
easier,
and increase the buy, right? Yeah. Which is, I think, what they want to do. And then sometimes it's sold through digital, and it's not bought up front, and it's bought more the way that a display ad would be bought.
Well, I think everybody references like the Olympics, and it's sort of like in the ad technology world, everybody uses an auto sale as okay. We're gonna justify this based on the way the auto industry works. Well, it's an anomaly. The Olympics are an anomaly. What we've all talked about here is a lot of overhead. And if you're a marketer, did anybody new buy my product? Well, that's the real challenge. How do I, marketing budgets aren't tripling just because we have digital, and so how does the marketer figure out with the networks, how do I make my ad dollars, my ad buy make sense and not screw up my ROI? And so that's the real challenge. And so when you have something like the Olympics, there's enough revenue in that for NBC that they can make all this sort of the nasty bits and things. They can hide them with people and all the rest of it. I think the challenge for the industry is how do you take the lessons from things like the Olympics and move them down the sales funnel.
Right.
Sure. I guess my question was more, what do we think the TV industry, how do we think the TV industry wants to sell this new TV everywhere inventory that is being created?
How do networks?
I mean, maybe it's a question for Richard, which is like, there's a very incredibly valuable model that I think still has value for both publishers and advertisers. Their advertisers wouldn't buy it if they don't think that they're accomplishing their marketing goals. So it seems like it's being sold a lot of different ways right now. If you could,
sure.
Like, what's your perfect world?
Well, the cases that you outlined before are all very much alive and happening at A&E. Sometimes digital inventory is sold on a standalone basis. Oftentimes it's packaged together with what we sell on linear, and then on the rare occasion, I suppose it's thrown in as a deal sweetener from time to time, although my colleagues in ad sales would likely argue that there's discrete value associated with everything that goes out there. But
they would not want to hear you say that they throw it in sometimes. Sometimes exactly. We throw it in.
Look, I think ultimately we would like to be able to really underscore the value of digital and latch on to some of these technologies, whether it's targeting or addressability, that can really make digital advertising sing. But the fact is, just as the way we talked about there being a lot of inertia in the market itself, and a lot of challenges and complexity in the technology platforms, I'll be quite frank with you. I think there's some organizational inertia, within certainly my company and others,
and most advertisers.
Well, exactly. As to how do we align our ad sales group in the most effective manner to go out and really exploit digital advertising for all it's worth. But the ultimate litmus test is, when I look at all of the inventory I have available, one of the exercises that we do a lot at A&E is try to estimate, what percentage of viewing, what percentage of the time that viewers spend with our content is on the linear platform versus the set-top on-demand platform versus broadband TV everywhere. And I'll be deadly honest with you. It's right now, outside of linear, that percentage is very small. I'm not going to say exactly how much, but think single digits, low percentage, right? So again, it goes back to the ROI issue. Organizationally, how much effort do I really want to put behind that when most of my business is being driven by what's happening on linear?
Strategically, just to play devil's advocate with this, if you're looking at it as a small piece, and I think, as that Times article pointed out yesterday with ABC's content, it's a big piece of video on demand is getting to be a very significant piece, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So video on demand together with these other TV everywhere platforms, if you look at it strategically as from your perspective, from a programmer's perspective, as driving that time spent from DVR into other platforms where you can better monetize it? Because half, 60%, 65% of impressions on a DVR are just vaporized from ad skipping, right? So, it might be a small piece on these platforms, but if it takes viewing out of DVR and where you can actually insert ads, and you can control the skipping, you can prevent it, you can.
Oh, absolutely, right? Yeah. A&E has been one of the staunchest supporters of the set-top VOD platform, and now we're wading much further into the TV Everywhere space. And we do realize that one of the benefits is because that kind of viewing hopefully displaces what viewers are doing on their own with DVR and potentially skipping through commercials. I mean, the dirty little secret is, though, it's also a mixed bag in terms of whether or not viewers can fast forward through content on the set-top platform, for instance. Right. Depending on who the operator is, depending on who the content owner is, there's different leverage plays that go on, and it's not a very consistent experience. But the great thing about on demand is that on a set-top basis, well, the C3 part that you mentioned before, we're seeing as absolutely critical to our on-demand strategy. We do a lot of research to figure out just how big an impact it's having, and on a show-by-show basis, depending on, again, which market you're talking about, we can see a contribution towards C3 ratings of anywhere from 5% to 10% for a given show. That is huge.
From VOD.
Yeah. Right. And that when you talk about ROI, I mean, that it's definitely there. But I also look at C3 as a bit of an anachronism, right? As we're all trying to plow forward with digital ad sales and harness the great technology that we could potentially use, in our desperation to make greater use of on-demand viewing, we've kind of gone backwards and latched on to the Nielsen metric. And it's not the wrong decision. It's a great way to make money, but at the same time, I don't think it's a great leap forward in terms of what we could be doing with digital, if that makes sense.
Well, that goes back to Pat's comments about advertisers and agencies and the way they're buying, planning, thinking about these platforms. So, we have a lot of chicken and egg issues here.
There are, and there have been for 10 years.
Measurement companies are not going to come out of the gate with waving a flag about a new currency that costs them a lot of money to develop until networks are willing to pay for it. Networks don't pay for it until advertisers and agencies buy on it, right?
But I think, you're seeing some fundamental changes. I mean, some of the things that Rentrack is doing on the measurement side are changing attitudes. It's a slow slog.
Like on the measurement side for linear television or VOD
for linear.
or TV? Okay.
For linear. I mean, they're linear, what is it called?
Linear Essentials?
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, TV Essentials.
TV Essentials, yeah. It starts to pull some of the pictures together for individual households, because it's showing you can show you between linear or TV Essentials and VOD Essentials. It can give you a picture of a household. Few of the TV ad networks and video networks are allowing you to buy into local. So, yes, household targeting is the holy grail, but, buying local for a lot of advertisers would be an improvement over the way they're able to buy using web metrics today in the TV space. So, I mean, there's just a lot of sticky wicket things, which you go to and you start to walk an agency buying team through it, and they just see you next year when you've got to figure it out.
So to get back to some of the, and from more of a technical standpoint, to get back to some of this scale issue here, one thing that I think was mentioned a couple times here is the process of authentication. I know Adobe Primetime, I believe, or Adobe has Adobe Pass, which is, you could talk a little bit about that, Ashley, maybe. But Duncan, from just a standpoint, broader technical standpoint, what a lot of people in the industry seem to be saying is it's so complicated for consumers to authenticate that's holding back viewing time on these platforms, that you have to re-authenticate at various times on the same device, and and they can't find their passwords, which I can't believe, but.
I actually think that's a pretty short-term issue that we've got wrapped around the axle around. I mean, if you look at the way that, as Ashley said, Comcast are starting to use social login. We've got a lot of these kind of capabilities now. There obviously will be a lag as consumer education sort of proceeds. So quite frankly, I'm pretty sure that we can get around that one. I think the...
And is that, and can I just, because I want to understand, is that what Adobe Pass does, is that universal across all the operators, or are there other standards that are?
So what we do is we
Sorry,
integrate,
Duncan, I didn't mean to.
No problem. So the way that works is we integrate with 150 operators and satellite providers, and then it means that the programmer, like A&E, just has to integrate with Adobe Pass, and then we can authenticate any consumer that comes in against 150 different pay TV accounts.
Okay.
But we do not determine, because it's not our pass, when you're logging into, when you're actually entering your Comcast password or your Time Warner Cable
or your Facebook
or Facebook, it's not on an Adobe site for security reasons. It's on the operator site, so it's shown within an iframe, or the consumer's taken to their page. And so, like, we operate the service that basically connects all the dots, but we're reliant on how each individual pay TV provider allows you to prove that you have access to that channel. And that's, that is where we work with those entities, but it's up to them to allow in-home authentication or social authentication, which they are absolutely investing in.
So, Duncan, is that what you mean by it's under, we've sort of got it under wraps, but these kind of details need to be cleared up?
At that level, I think people like Adobe are doing a pretty good job of sorting through those issues, and we'll see those starting to get resolved fairly quickly. I think there's another couple of things that we have seen fairly recently, which is just on the plain encryption level. In terms of the way that content is actually distributed, we've started to see programmers get much more specific because you're going to a whole bunch of different devices. We saw one very recently in the Caribbean, for instance, where the operator firmly believed that the only way they were actually going to be able to get the content rights was to be able to implement per session encryption. Which is an enormous issue for operators who basically...
Because of concerns about security from the programmer standpoint, security of their content.
You don't own the end device anymore. Right? So you don't know what's going... you're going to something that could be basically anything. So the challenge that they were presented with is to be able... to be able to afford the content rights to the relatively small audiences that they were going to. I mean, this is not a Comcast, obviously. This is a smaller operator going to very specific audiences. They believed that they had to implement a completely different methodology for distribution to the end device. And that basically meant that the structure of their literally the way that they built their infrastructure had to fundamentally change. So the challenge that we were faced with at that point was, how do we make this work from a business standpoint, right? It wasn't just about sort of adding some new devices down at the edge, because that would have actually negated their whole profitability model. We then had to make sure that you look back up the chain and basically say, okay, how can we save cost here? How can we do repackaging at this level? How can we make sure that they have a model for dynamic ad insertion that they can actually go and recover some of this additional cost? So I think that there is still an interesting business case to be made at the infrastructure level. I don't think it's very well understood right now. But what that's going to do, a lot of what's going to determine that is the kind of stuff that was being talked about earlier, where we have to the sort of the money trail has to be adjusted at this point. We have to get the ad agencies and the buyers to the point where they understand this technology or understand the opportunities enough, and they can see the benefits enough for this to, for that money to be then being pushed downstream into the operators.
Right, because like, as Ashley, I think you said before, consumers are getting what they want. They always get what they want, but that costs the operators a lot of money to put those systems in place, all that technology to do this stuff, and there has to be an ROI there, obviously from keeping subscribers and reducing churn and getting better subscribers, but the ROI has to be there for the programmers.
And I think what I feel like has changed over the past 2 years is, I feel like, and Richard, again, you should weigh in here, I feel like most MVPDs and programmers, whether broadcast or cable networks, have gone from, do we need to do this? Like, do I need to put my content online? Does the consumer really want this? Like, look what happened to the music industry. Is this even a good idea? To, I'm making announcements like ABC or Turner announcing that they're going to stream TBS and TNT.
You're talking about a change in programmers or operators?
Both of them.
Yeah, okay,
I think Comcast has definitely changed their view on kind of multi-screen significantly.
For the same underlying reasons or for different reasons?
I think it's just I think it's things like Netflix and things like YouTube and others where I think people are committed to providing content across screens to consumers. And they're right now facing the reality of the tremendous cost and complexity of actually realizing that commitment. And so while I think the technology challenges ultimately will get kind of sorted out over the next 2 to 4 years, there is a huge amount of cost and complexity, right? Which I think you've done a good job.
I think Pat was really hit the nail on the head. At the end of the day, until the agencies absolutely see an easy methodology to understand what the ROI is. At scale. And what they're able to do is to say, I ran this ad. Here's my opportunity. I've got this ad going to this audience, and this is the direct response, and I want to see that virtually in real time. Then I think the challenge that we're going to have is that it's going to be a hard education to be able to put the pieces together.
Right.
Well, and I think you're seeing, agencies are putting pressure on some of their infrastructure partners, the media oceans of the world who are key to the reconciliation in terms of accounts. And you're seeing, some new companies. There's a company called SMI who's doing across media measurement using data out of Mediaocean in partnership with agencies. You've got, I mentioned earlier, Rentrack. So you're seeing sort of this little, chipping at the side, and that has to continue. And to the extent that networks understand, their commodity, the commodity you're dealing in is eyeballs, right? And that doesn't change. And the whole reason of having eyeballs is so that I, as a consumer, buy something. I mean, that's, at the end of the day, it's a basic bottom line. I, as an advertiser or marketer, I want you, the consumer, to buy something.
And so television's always been a mass reach vehicle.
Yeah, and what's the most effective way to get it?
I think there is a change that is signaled by the integration of this technology, and I think we all see it to a certain extent. And I think that the metric, one could argue that the metric isn't necessarily going to be eyeballs in the future. The metric is going to be the actual response.
Right.
Because what we're really looking at here is the ability to target an ad at somebody and then to watch the upstream. And basically say, fine, within a defined period of time, they specifically did something.
Right.
Because that's what I really want to be able to see.
No, I think this is an important issue. I think we have a few more minutes. We can touch on it some more. I mean, one thing I noticed...
We're in fierce agreement on that one.
And one thing I did a little field research a couple of nights ago and last night in preparation with it, and I went on some TV Everywhere apps. I authenticated my iPad with some new services I hadn't authenticated with before. No, I mean, I've been authenticated before, Duncan. I'm not a complete novice. I just mean I went onto new sites and things.
Dog food, the new and enhanced
so,
dog food.
One thing that's very obvious is that the ad loads on all of these platforms are minuscule.
Yes.
A couple of minutes, 3 minutes compared to, 15, 16, 17-minute ad loads on broadcast and cable. And so, question, I guess, Richard can weigh in on this and everybody, but can programmers monetize this kind of fragmentation across these devices if the ad loads are going to be?
Well, before you get, Richard, you should answer this, but I think there's a... I have to. No, you have to. No, but it's a real key fundamental...
But I think it ties into the data, because the value of those impressions could be higher if data is brought in.
Right, but you're going into, Richard's going into this traditional TV buyer, which is, over 5-10 years has been, and everybody says they're all 40 or 50 and they're dying. They're not. There are a lot of 20-year-old buyers in TV land. And they're used to this CPM of, let's say, $15.
Right.
All right. Now you're going to go in there and tell them to think differently. And how do you do it?
Well, fortunately, that's not my job.
Well, and I guess that's a question. Is that what the programmer wants to do? Or ultimately, is this really what needs to happen is an equivalent metric so that you can go in and you can say, you don't have to think differently. There's just more eyeballs because we're adding TV to iPad, to iPhone, to Android. And that number does not exist today. But that's what I was trying to get at, which is like, what does programmer want? Does programmer want an equivalent digital number to the TV number so that they can go in and people don't have to think differently? Or do they want people to think differently and buy it differently and buy it based on addressability versus GRP?
Yeah, those are all great questions. And you know what, guys, I can't profess to be the real expert in the ad sales area, so I'm not going to pretend that I really know the answers to these questions. But I think it all goes back to finding the right balance or the right equilibrium. We're obviously going to go out in the market and try to extract as much value as we can from any of the inventory that we're selling. I've worked a lot on the set-top VOD platform in partnership with folks on the ad sales side. I've made sales calls together with them. The old reasons why we try to get people to purchase VOD, we talk about things like, well, because there are so few ads in VOD, you can have an exclusive presence or a clutter-free presence, and those are all arguments that you can use to jack up the CPMs. Well, what happens when you start selling more ads and that once clutter-free environment now becomes more cluttered? Does the availability of more inventory put downward pressure on your CPMs? I mean, those are all the sorts of issues that get factored into the equation. Honestly, I don't know the answer to all those questions, but those are an example of the things that are being considered as my skilled colleagues in ad sales go out and try and solve these issues.
Right. And if you're going into agencies and and asking them to buy the more eyeballs in the same programming context, but at a higher CPM, that's a difficult conversation to have unless you really do have the data, unless you can reduce that proposition to a number of a savings, a reduction of waste, and a savings of trying to reach a true target. That is I know from experience, a very difficult conversation to have. They say, heck, I already have a ton of points on cable. I don't need more points at a higher CPM.
That's a great point. Right. I think you were at the On Demand Summit a couple of weeks ago, and the issue that, for again going back to set-top VOD, I forget how many DAI-enabled households there are in the U.S. right now.
About 30 million that Black Arrow has enabled now, which is the Comcast footprint and the Time Warner footprint are right now DAI enabled.
One of the panelists at the event, I believe, was from an agency. He was saying, I'm hearing a lot about dynamic ad insertion for cable set-top right now, but you know what? The truth is, I can already go out and get those 30 million households when I buy linear. Right. So is there really that much of a value differentiation?
So now that's where this ties back into data, because if you can actually show that here's the households I'm reaching with my linear cable buy, and now I go to these TV everywhere platforms, and it's not a reach extension argument. It could be if you think you're missing, if you think you're missing a lot of frequency on that audience, it could be a reach extension. But if you don't have that working for you, there's a clear efficiency argument, which is it costs me this much money on a CPM basis, and my effective CPM is twice as high because of the comp. I'm not going to get too much into this, but it's because of the and if I target one-to-one at the household based on the data I have about that household or to the viewer modeled out, then I eliminate that waste. But that depends upon an agency and an advertiser understanding who their true target actually is, right?
Well, and you know, and it's, we talk about agencies, you know, the network goes and talks to the agency, but unless it's a huge advertiser, they're probably not talking to the marketer themselves. Mm-hmm. And so that agency then has to go in and rep their media plan for the year based upon what the CMO is used to paying, or the media buyer at the marketer. So it's a multi-stage project, and that's why I think, you know, you're still seeing a lot of experimental dollars in the space. But you know, as the data then proves out the experiments, you start, you know, there's the opportunity for increased purchase. But it's not a switch that's going to be flipped. I know by I have.
And I think, you know, as Richard was saying, until it's, you know, double-digit percentages of time spent with television content, you know, it's all these things kind of have to fall into place. The technology has to enable getting to enough devices that you build enough audience engagement that people like the A&E sales team is like, whoa, this is now 20% of my available inventory. Like, I really care about this right now. And so, you know, all of this is going to take more than 12 months.
Right. As someone early on in my sales career told me, and I think it's very true, that, you know, at the end of the day, 90% of these people are just guys who want to go home at 5:30 and have a beer. And unless you make it incredibly obvious what a huge value proposition it is, it's really hard.
And I think the thing you have to believe about TV Everywhere fundamentally is that there is a consumer demand for TV to mean the content, not the device, and that they obviously will continue to watch a huge amount of television on that great big screen in the living room, but that screen will be connected to the internet. I mean, look at Xbox One announcement yesterday. That was pretty significant.
Right.
I mean, you have to believe that over time, the percentage of engagement with content, premium TV content, is going to be powered by the internet, regardless of the screen that goes to it. And if you believe that, then yes, there are a ton of problems. There needs to be better data. Marketers have to understand how they're driving consideration and purchase. But if this is big enough inventory, people will figure it out.
Well, I think so. Well said. So I think, I apologize, but I think we've run a couple minutes long, but I've been told we can run over. If there are people that have questions, can you guys stay a few minutes? Okay.
Yeah. I have a question.
Yeah.
I wonder the whole ad situation, who even really watches ads now? Do people really believe people are watching ads? I mean, you're on like 5 different screens.
Okay, I think we're out of time for questions. We're all in the ad business here, so let's. No, it's a great question. So clearly, most ads are being skipped in the DVR environment. I know I can speak. Comcast has a corporate priority that they've openly talked about of driving as much viewing as possible to the VOD environment, and that's one of the reasons. Again, consumers are getting what they want. They've got these devices that, clearly. I don't think anybody in cable could possibly disagree with this. The cable industry missed the beat on video on demand 10 years ago. If they had come out with a great product that really made sense, great discovery, you might not have the penetration of DVRs that you do today. They missed that, and now they've got another shot at it, basically, and they realize that. So it's a big problem, and people have clearly shown a propensity to skip ads. But
I think there's a couple of things to remember. One of the reasons that we want to get this technology sort of sorted out is because of the almost limitless opportunity that we have for different formats of ads. I mean, okay, so I don't want to watch a 30-second ad because, after 3 seconds I'm banging my head on the ceiling, or wanting to see something else. But if you look at, what's been driven on the web, nobody watches a 30-second ad. Everybody skips it or does something. So guess what? I mean, what it's forced the content creators to do, the ad creators to do, is to come up with fundamentally different ways of doing things. So I think the challenge that we've got here is, from a delivery and standpoint is to not to be thinking about the fact that, okay, we've got 15 to 30 second ads and that's what we've got to cope with. It's actually to be saying, no, there's a completely different engagement model possible.
I totally agree with that, yeah.
But over and over again, if you do research with consumers, you will find that if it's something I don't want, it's called an ad. If it's something that I want, I'm interested in a product, I'm interested, it's content.
Right.
And I've done this for 15 years. And,
I mean, we have really
Great
yet
point.
to see, as an industry, we have yet to see what the consumer tolerance for ads would be in a rational ad-supported television environment, where you're not seeing massive frequencies of some ads that have no relevance for you, you know, and ads for things like, you know, retail that have, you know, were last weekend, were, you know, over the weekend, and you're seeing it on Monday. It's, you know, and these are the things that dynamic ad insertion, for one thing, you know, is beginning to solve on these.
Dynamic targeted ad insertion.
Targeted dynamic.
I think that what you just said there was absolutely the key to all of this. Yeah, you know, what we can't do is we can't just think that what we're going to do is we're going to recreate the sort of linear cable experience on an online platform, because that's ridiculous.
Right.
I mean, at the end of the day, what we want to do is to make sure that what we're able to do is to deliver something which is targeted so that it becomes content.
That's right.
And it's seamless enough, and we've got all of the other, you know, stupid stuff, the stupid technical stuff like loudness and all of that taken care of as well, because they will be regulated.
Yeah.
These will be regulated.
But more than, I mean, the vast majority of Americans still watch TV at time of air. Like, the majority of Americans still watch.
I think if you factor in sports and news, certainly.
And they do watch the ads.
Yeah.
I mean, people are still watching ads. They're not watching as many of them as they did 10 years ago, but they absolutely still watch ads.
Can we get another question in the back there?
Yeah.
It's interesting that YouTube wasn't really mentioned at all in this conversation. Is that not seen as a platform where it can easily be monetized?
They sell the inventory.
Yeah, I don't think that there was consciously left out. YouTube is definitely a powerful platform.
Well, we also kind of set the stage, I think, at the beginning by talking about TV everywhere as an authenticated way of watching television. So, you know, YouTube is the model where you don't have to have a cable subscription or a satellite subscription. I think, you know, as a content provider, we want to be conscious of all of the different distribution channels that we have at our disposal to get our content in front of the eyes of our viewers. However, at the same time, you know, one of the things you have to remember about the cable-specific content providers is we all grew up in an industry where we benefited from a dual revenue stream. And we're not rushing to create high value content for, you know, YouTube and the free Hulu platform when we have a better potential, you know, for recouping that investment through the dual revenue stream. So I think that's an important point of differentiation.
Yep. And I think it's interesting that YouTube just launched subscription, because that's, I think they're recognizing that ads alone are not going to entice all the content they want.
Great panel. How is the 508 compliant FCC mandate for linear content going into IP? How is that affecting you? Are there benefits there, opportunities for better search?
I don't understand the topic. I'm sorry. Can you explain to me what it is? Oh, it's captions?
That's 608.
Oh, sorry, so it's closed.
608, not 508. You totally threw us with 508.
I was like, oh no, there's another one.
There is 5, 6, and 7.
Yeah. 608 and 708. That's more.
The FCC is mandating closed captions in content if it's linear and then goes online.
I can talk about it. Do you want to?
You know, to us, it's just something that we know we have to support.
Yes.
It's something that we have to do the metadata preservation to, you know, to make sure that it happens. You know, it's it was originally seen as some premium value. It's now something that has to be there. So from my point of view, I would say it's going to drive upgrades, and it's going to drive some serious thought about the way that people actually do this stuff. And quite frankly, what it's going to do is it's going to force the conversation for, you know, the CDN infrastructure that doesn't support it and doesn't actually enable it and doesn't help with it further into commoditization, which is quite frankly good for us because we're actually the value piece on the top of it. So with that, I'll hand over to Ashley to explain the rest of it.
We look at it similarly, that from a video playback perspective, it's something that we just have to support, and we currently support it. And the nice thing is, again, it creates this update cycle of, okay, we have to support closed captioning, so we're going to update our video player. Maybe we'll add more content to it. Right? So it's a feature, and there are deadlines. So it has to be done.
But it does raise an interesting specter, because it's not just the closed captioning piece that eventually, starts to affect us. If we're starting to think about ad insertion, and the assumption that what we're going to have is we're going to have ads being pulled into streams and stitched into streams, then, at some point the FCC starts to come along and basically goes, loudness regulation, this, that, the other.
Right.
And a lot of that stuff is not yet being thought through as well. And basically we're raising the spectra of stuff which is, encoded in completely different platforms all over the place, all of a sudden being integrated into things, pulled in, on a dynamic basis. We're going to have to deal with those issues. We know how to deal with them, but a lot of the architecture that's been designed doesn't support that yet, and will have to. So, it's actually when you broaden that out, it's a pretty interesting area.
I'm getting the wrap-up music playing sign, so I guess that's it. So thank you very much to the panel, and thank you for coming.